I didn't choose reporting as a career. It really picked me before I picked it. And you hear about preachers and evangelists saying that they were called to be preachers by some divine power. And I think a little bit, in some ways, journalism hooked me in that same way. It started when I was in high school in a very, very, very small town in Mississippi with a population of 7,000 people. We had 2 banks, a few clothing stores. We had 3 drugstores. We had a theater which was called the Magnolia Theater, and it cost 25 cents to see a movie there. Except when Elvis was in town, they charged when an Elvis movie was in town, they charged 35 cents. When I was in high school, I was selected to write a column called The School News for the local weekly newspaper, the New Albany Gazette. And the first day I went down to drop off my column, which they paid me $1 a week to do, I walked in to the newspaper and I suddenly thought I had discovered life on this planet. It was the only place in this little sleepy town where there was any real heartbeat at all. There were presses running, there were people walking around, and they were printing newspapers for other small towns as well. And it was really the center of activity in this little town. And I didn't really realize it at that point, but I had already become hooked on journalism just by walking in that day. It's true. I mean, from a practical standpoint, I don't think that journalism is something you choose as a career. There's really very little logic to choosing journalism as a career because the commitment it requires is extraordinary, and the pay is relatively low, particularly in relationship to the degree of commitment and the time you have to put into it. So it's really only something to do if you really love it. So I went to work at the Jackson Clarion-Ledger. I was 21, and I was incredibly green and incredibly inexperienced. And my first assignment was to cover the Republican Party in Mississippi, which was not a very good assignment because the Republican Party in Mississippi in those days was extremely, extremely small. In fact, the joke was that they had their convention in a telephone booth. So it was a bad assignment. But once again, I got really lucky. That year, it was 1976, it turned out that the Mississippi delegation played a very key role in determining who would be the Republican nominee for president that year between Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford. So as I was following the story, it got bigger and bigger, and I got assigned to start covering Ford and Reagan as they came through the state. And I also got assigned to cover the Republican National Convention, which that year was in Kansas City. And I'll tell you, that was the biggest city I had ever been to in my life. So I just remember just being incredibly naive and eager and frenetic as a reporter. And I was assigned to ride on the campaign plane with then Governor Reagan, and I was just determined that I was going to get an interview with Governor Reagan. And I was just being annoying with his press secretary, and I kept repeatedly asking for this interview. And I know he really wanted to get rid of me. So finally, we were flying somewhere, and I'm sitting in the back of the plane. He comes back and he says, Governor Reagan will speak with you now. And I was totally shocked. I had no idea that he would really give me an interview. And I panicked because I didn't know what to ask. So I got up to the interview, and I really blew it because I had no questions prepared. I had been very aggressive in obtaining this interview, but I just simply was not prepared to do the interview at all. And that is an example of how much of an on-the-job training this job was for me. Newsday had this incredible history of doing investigative reporting. And I don't know how many of you here got to meet Bob Greene when he was on the faculty here, but he was really considered the father of modern-day investigative reporting and was the investigations editor at Newsday for many years. So Newsday had this tradition of investigative reporting. And one of the things, the only story I worked on for the entire time that I was on the investigations team at Newsday was this story that Howie described about cops on disability. And our goal was to find police officers from Long Island who were on disability pensions because they were supposedly injured on the job and they couldn't do their jobs. And we were trying to find out what they were really capable of doing. And we worked on that story for a year and a half. And we found police who were supposedly disabled. We found one who was working as a lifeguard at Jones Beach with a bad knee. But he had passed his state exam for being a lifeguard, which meant that he had to jump out of one of those big lifeguard chairs, run down the beach and into the crashing waves and rescue somebody. And we found somebody else who was a hang glider who was supposedly disabled, and on and on. And the public outcry against that story was just incredible because taxpayers were mad and they were upset that their tax dollars were going for this. And the interesting thing about that story was that while we were working on it, and Howie was managing editor at that time, nobody ever asked us why it was taking so long or how much it cost. And it must have cost, I have no idea, but it must have cost $500,000 for Newsday to produce that story. Because we had 2 reporters working on it for a year and a half. We had photographers, we had editors, we had travel expenses. Many of those travel expenses were driving down the Long Island Expressway. We actually followed these people to find out what they did. These opportunities that I had at Newsday were the foundation for my getting the job that I currently have at the New York Times. The New York Times investigations team, which is where I work now, is larger than it has ever been. And that's because the management of the New York Times knows that investigative reporting is important, but also I believe that it's a strategic business decision because they understand that readers care about what's going on in their communities. They care about what their politicians are doing, and they think that ultimately readers don't want to read the same thing over and over, the same entertainment stories, the same stories about beauty and hairdos and whatever that populates some of the magazines and newspapers that you see. This week, one of my colleagues, Michael Moss, won a Pulitzer Prize for writing about meat, and he spent 6 months tracking down the ingredients in a particular hamburger that made a woman disabled for the rest of her life. And he revealed what's really in the hamburger that some of us eat. But, so I guess I've buried the lead. The lead is that I don't think my life as a reporter could be duplicated today. And I think I could still get a job as a reporter, but I would miss some of the chances to do the harder-hitting journalism that I've done because of cutbacks that are happening at a lot of newspapers, small newspapers, medium-sized newspapers, and even large newspapers, and reduced commitment to investigative kind of journalism at these newspapers.